Tonight, we're uncovering one of the most surprising and overlooked chapters of World War II, the time when Japanese forces invaded American soil. Not Hawaii, not the West Coast, but a remote, frozen chain of islands off the coast of Alaska. This is the forgotten story of the Battle of the Aleutian Islands, a war fought in fog, ice, and silence, where the terrain was as deadly as the enemy. It's a tale of resilience, sacrifice, and survival at the edge of the world. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's journey to the windswept shores of Attu and Kiska, and learn how war came to the most unlikely place in America. When most people think of World War II, they picture the beaches of Normandy, the deserts of North Africa, or the islands of the Pacific. But in 1942, the war came to a place no one expected, a remote, frozen chain of volcanic islands stretching out from the coast of Alaska into the North Pacific. These were the Aleutian Islands. Rugged, treeless, battered by storms, and shrouded in fog, they seemed an unlikely setting for battle. And yet, for a brief but critical moment, they became the front lines of a forgotten war on American soil. The attack came just 6 months after Pearl Harbor. By the summer of 1942, Japan had swept across the Pacific, capturing the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. Morale in the United States was low, and the war seemed far from won. Most Americans were focused on the battles raging in Europe and the South Pacific. Few could have pointed to the Aleutians on a map. But the Japanese High Command had a different view. They understood the strategic importance of Alaska and its remote island chain. If Japan could occupy the Aleutians, they could control parts of the North Pacific and potentially threaten the U.S. mainland or disrupt supply lines to the Soviet Union. To achieve this, Japan launched a two-part operation. One was a massive, coordinated attack on the island of Midway, a trap designed to draw out and destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The other was a smaller, secondary move, the occupation of the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska. It was a clever distraction. While the world focused on Midway, Japanese forces quietly sailed north through freezing, storm-tossed waters. On June 6, 1942, they landed on Kiska. The next day, they took Attu. Both islands were sparsely populated. Just a few American personnel and Aleut natives lived there. The Japanese met little resistance. Within hours, 2 pieces of American soil had fallen to foreign invaders. It was the first time since the War of 1812 that a foreign power had occupied U.S. territory. News of the invasion shocked the American public. Alaska was far away, yes, but it was American. The idea that Japanese troops could set foot on U.S. soil stirred fear and fury. President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered an immediate response, and the U.S. military scrambled to organize a counterattack. But the Aleutians were unlike any battlefield the Americans had encountered. The islands were cold, windswept, and covered in a thick, blinding fog that often lasted for weeks. Temperatures hovered near freezing even in summer, and storms with hurricane-force winds rolled in without warning. Supply lines were long, resources were scarce, and visibility was so poor that pilots nicknamed the Aleutians the birthplace of the Williwaw, a sudden, violent wind that could knock a plane out of the sky. Still, the U.S. began building airbases on nearby islands like Adak and Amchitka. From there, they launched bombing raids and reconnaissance flights. But it was slow going. American forces would need months to prepare for a proper assault. Meanwhile, the Japanese dug in. On both Kiska and Attu, they built bunkers, laid mines, and prepared for a long occupation. The terrain favored defense, and they were determined to hold their ground, no matter how isolated or miserable it became. And so, while the major headlines of World War II focused on the epic clash at Midway, a colder, quieter, and far more mysterious battle had begun in the far north. The Forgotten Front, the Battle of the Aleutians, was underway. By the summer of 1942, the Aleutian Islands had become one of the most unforgiving battlegrounds in World War II. While the world's attention remained fixed on Europe and the Pacific, American and Japanese forces began to face off in the desolate, windswept wilderness of Alaska's outermost islands, with each side fighting not just one another, but the brutal environment itself. The islands of Attu and Kiska, now under Japanese occupation, were cut off from the mainland by hundreds of miles of open sea. Reinforcing and supplying them was no easy task, even for the Japanese Navy. But the weather, not the distance, was the greatest enemy. The Aleutians were infamous for sudden squalls, zero visibility, and freezing rain that turned every rock into a slick death trap. Pilots often described flying in the region as trying to navigate through a milk bottle filled with smoke. Still, both sides understood the stakes. For the Japanese, holding the Aleutians meant maintaining a strategic northern perimeter. It served as a psychological blow to the United States, a reminder that their homeland wasn't untouchable. The occupation also tied down valuable American resources and provided Japan with a buffer zone for operations in the Pacific. For the Americans, retaking the islands became a matter of pride, sovereignty, and strategy. The psychological impact of losing even the smallest patch of U.S. soil was enormous. More importantly, military leaders feared that the Aleutians could be used as a launch point for attacks on the West Coast or to sever connections with the Soviet Union, who was, at the time, receiving American support through the Lend-Lease Act. To counter the Japanese presence, the U.S. began constructing airfields and staging areas on nearby islands. Adak Island, located about 400 miles from Kiska, became a major hub. American engineers, soldiers, and Seabees worked around the clock, often in freezing rain and hurricane-force winds, to turn these volcanic rocks into forward operating bases. From these positions, the U.S. began launching bombing runs against Kiska and Attu. But the weather made missions unpredictable, and the fog often forced pilots to abort their flights or crash into the sea. In many cases, more planes were lost to the elements than to enemy fire. Ground crews struggled to keep runways clear and equipment functioning in the damp, salty air. Morale suffered, and some soldiers began calling the Aleutians the place where war forgot U.S. In the meantime, the Japanese dug in deeper. On Kiska, they established a heavily fortified base with radar, artillery, and underground bunkers. On Attu, smaller in both size and garrison, they built positions into the hills, well camouflaged and protected by the terrain. Supplies were brought in by submarine and aircraft when the weather permitted. But both sides suffered in silence. The soldiers posted to the Aleutians found themselves in one of the loneliest places on Earth. There were no towns, no civilians, and very little comfort. The volcanic soil was barren. The wind howled through every crack. And the fog, the ever-present fog, hung over everything like a curtain that never lifted. Meanwhile, back home, most Americans didn't even know a war was being fought in Alaska. Newspaper coverage was sparse. Reports from the front were minimal. And because the battles were small in number but high in casualties, the government chose to downplay them. Still, a showdown was coming. By late 1942, the U.S. had established enough infrastructure to begin planning a full-scale invasion. The goal, retake Attu and Kiska, push the Japanese from American soil, and close the northern front once and for all. But the Americans had no idea just how brutal that task would be. By the spring of 1943, the United States was ready to strike back. The foggy skies over the Aleutian Islands had concealed too much for too long. American military planners, hardened by months of treacherous bombing missions and miserable conditions, had laid the groundwork for a bold, if not risky, move, the retaking of Attu Island, the westernmost point of the Japanese occupation in Alaska. The operation was codenamed Operation Land Crab. Attu was chosen first for several reasons. It had fewer Japanese troops than Kiska, and its recapture would serve as both a tactical foothold and a much-needed morale boost. But even a small, island battle in the Aleutians was a nightmare in the making. The island's treacherous weather, steep ridges, and volcanic terrain were challenges no war game could fully prepare for. The Japanese had fortified Attu with a force of around 2,500 men, under the command of Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki. Most were members of the elite Northern Garrison Unit, experienced and well-armed. Yamasaki was no fool. He understood the importance of holding the island and had positioned his troops strategically in the rugged interior, avoiding the obvious landing zones along the coast. They were prepared to fight, and die, for every inch. The U.S. assembled an invasion force of over 15,000 troops, including the 7th Infantry Division, many of whom had trained for desert warfare. Instead, they were now being shipped into icy hell. Cold weather gear was issued last minute. Few had experienced fighting in such extreme conditions. But orders were orders. On May 11, 1943, American forces began landing on Attu. The operation started with landings at Massacre Bay and Holt's Bay, separated by towering ridges and sharp valleys. Soldiers poured onto the beaches with their weapons wrapped in plastic, and their faces stung by the wind. At first, resistance was light. Many believed the Japanese had fled or had been bombed into submission. They were wrong. Yamasaki had instructed his men to hold fire, to let the Americans come inland, deeper into the difficult terrain. The Japanese positions were hidden in caves, bunkers, and ravines. When they finally opened fire, it was with deadly precision. American troops suddenly found themselves pinned down by machine gun nests and snipers they couldn't even see. The fighting quickly devolved into a muddy, chaotic nightmare. The Aleutian weather struck with full force. Freezing rain poured down. Soldiers sank into the tundra. Visibility dropped to near zero. Foxholes flooded. Equipment froze. Medical evacuations were nearly impossible. Many suffered from frostbite, trench foot, and hypothermia. And still, the Japanese fought back fiercely, never allowing the Americans to fully settle into their positions. Every ridge gained was paid for in blood. Every advance was under threat of a hidden ambush. The terrain gave the defenders every advantage. Worse still, friendly fire became a constant danger. In the fog, soldiers couldn't always tell friend from foe. Air support often bombed or strafed the wrong targets. Radio communication failed. Supply drops missed their marks. Some units became completely cut off. By the fifth day, it was clear this would not be a quick battle. And while the world focused on Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, a frozen island, smaller than most cities, became the site of one of the most brutal and underreported battles in American military history. What lay ahead on Attu would test the limits of endurance, loyalty, and survival. And the worst was yet to come. The Battle of Attu was supposed to take just a few days. In reality, it turned into a nearly 3-week nightmare, a battle not just against an enemy, but against nature itself. By the end of the first week, American forces had managed to secure beachheads at Massacre Bay and Holt's Bay, but their progress inland was slow, exhausting, and deadly. The Japanese defenders, well hidden and deeply entrenched in the rocky slopes and snow-covered ridges, fought with a desperation born of isolation and honor. They had no expectation of reinforcements, no hope of evacuation. They were here to hold the island, or die trying. The terrain was unlike anything the American troops had faced before. There were no trees, no cover, just jagged ridges, endless mud, and icy winds that tore through their uniforms. Visibility was nearly always poor. The Aleutian fog, a thick, suffocating veil, would descend without warning and linger for hours, even days. In those moments, the battlefield went quiet, not from peace, but from suspense. You couldn't see, but you knew the enemy was out there, watching. Every advance felt like stepping into a trap. Many soldiers found themselves bogged down in knee-deep mud, unable to move quickly, their rifles caked in dirt, their fingers numb with cold. The sharp volcanic rocks shredded boots. Slopes became ice-covered death slides. Trench foot and frostbite spread like wildfire. Medics worked without shelter, without enough supplies, often operating under enemy fire. The psychological toll was just as severe. Sleep was scarce. Food was cold. Letters from home were delayed or missing. And the enemy never stopped. Japanese snipers picked off soldiers as they crept through the mist. Small raiding parties launched sudden, vicious night attacks before vanishing back into the fog. Every sound, every gust of wind or scrape of metal, became a potential death sentence. Wounded soldiers often couldn't be evacuated fast enough. Many died where they fell. Those who survived were forced to lie in the freezing mud, waiting hours, sometimes days, for help. Supply lines from the beach were constantly disrupted. Even when air support arrived, bombers sometimes hit friendly positions due to the fog. Some units were cut off completely, forced to dig in and survive on what little they had. As American troops slowly gained ground, the Japanese fell back into the high ridges near Chichagov Harbor, their last stronghold. The terrain was brutal, and every gain came with heavy losses. But Colonel Yamasaki had no plans to surrender. Japanese doctrine at the time forbade surrender. Honor was valued above life. And Yamasaki, a veteran of the Manchurian campaign, was committed to making the Americans pay dearly for every step forward. His men continued to fight with remarkable discipline and resolve, even as their numbers dwindled and their supplies ran low. By late May, the Americans had pushed the Japanese into their final defensive positions, a network of caves and ridges surrounded by artillery and machine gun emplacements. Despite near-constant bombardment, the Japanese refused to break. They repelled multiple attacks. Even when outnumbered, they held. It was a war within a war, a quiet, vicious battle waged in one of the loneliest corners of the world. And for every soldier who fought there, the Aleutians became something more than just a name on a map. It became a place of ghosts. The final stand was approaching, and it would be unlike anything American forces had yet faced in the war. By late May 1943, the Japanese position on Attu Island was collapsing. After more than 2 weeks of relentless combat, freezing temperatures, and isolation, Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki and his remaining men were trapped in a shrinking pocket near Chichagov Harbor. They were outnumbered, surrounded, starving. But they were not surrendering. American troops had taken heavy casualties to push the Japanese into this final defensive corner. Fog and mud still ruled the battlefield. The air was thick with the stench of death and gunpowder. Wounded men lay scattered across the ridges. Even with control of most of the island, American soldiers moved cautiously, knowing one well-hidden machine gun or grenade attack could cost an entire squad. At this point, the Japanese force had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 men. Many were wounded, frostbitten, and starving. Their supplies were nearly gone. But Yamasaki knew what was expected of him, and what his emperor expected of every Japanese soldier. Surrender was not an option. So he chose one final act. On the night of May 28, 1943, under the cover of darkness and swirling fog, Yamasaki gathered his remaining troops, including the wounded. They fixed bayonets, tied white headbands around their foreheads, a symbol of sacrifice, and prepared for a massive banzai charge. It would be one of the largest suicide charges of the Pacific War. Just before dawn on May 29th, Yamasaki led his men in a full-force assault down the ridges and directly into the American lines. The attack was ferocious. The Japanese soldiers, many of them barely able to walk, stormed through U.S. positions with bayonets, swords, and grenades. Screaming, "Tenno Haika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" They overwhelmed the number of forward outposts and penetrated deep into the American rear. The surprise and violence of the charge threw U.S. units into chaos. Some soldiers panicked, others fought hand to hand. Medics, cooks, and clerks grabbed rifles and joined the defense. For hours, the battle devolved into close combat, trench knives, fists, rifle butts, and bayonets in the mud. The banzai charge pushed nearly 1.5 miles into American territory, a staggering distance for such a desperate force. But eventually, American firepower and numbers took their toll. Artillery, machine guns, and reinforcements stopped the advance. By mid-morning, most of the Japanese attackers were dead. Colonel Yamasaki was among them, killed during the assault, likely by a bullet to the chest. But the horror wasn't over. After the main charge was crushed, small groups of Japanese soldiers continued to resist. Some wounded men, hiding in ravines and foxholes, waited until American troops passed, then detonated grenades or charged with bayonets. American medics were targeted. Those trying to collect the dead were ambushed. The entire island felt haunted, filled with tension, smoke, and silence broken only by sudden bursts of violence. In the end, of the 2,500 Japanese troops who had landed on Attu, only 28 were taken alive, mostly those too injured to move. The rest were dead. American casualties were also staggering. Over 500 killed, 1,200 wounded, and hundreds more evacuated due to frostbite, disease, or exposure. For a single battle on a tiny island few Americans had heard of, the price was staggering. The Battle of Attu ended that day, not with a surrender, but with a final scream in the fog, a suicidal rush, and silence. The U.S. had reclaimed Attu, but Kiska still remained, and the next battle would prove even stranger. With Attu Island now under American control, the next target was clear: Kiska. Kiska was the larger and more developed of the two Japanese-held Aleutian Islands. It had been occupied since June 1942 and fortified with a strong garrison, radar stations, and coastal defenses. After the brutal and bloody battle for Attu, the U.S. military expected more of the same: difficult terrain, fanatical resistance, and high casualties. And so, Operation Cottage was launched, the code name for the Allied invasion of Kiska. Unlike Attu, this operation would not be handled by the United States alone. Canada, fighting alongside the U.S. throughout the war, contributed over 5,000 troops, joining more than 25,000 American soldiers. Warships, bombers, and landing craft were assembled. The operation was designed to be overwhelming. Military planners left nothing to chance. For weeks, Allied aircraft had bombed Kiska relentlessly. Navy vessels shelled the coastline. Reconnaissance reported signs of activity: radio transmissions, supply movements, smoke from cook fires. It was clear the Japanese were still there, and they were preparing. On August 15, 1943, after weeks of buildup, the invasion began. American and Canadian troops stormed the beaches, weapons ready, expecting a repeat of Attu, another battle in the fog, another fight through rock, mud, and cold. But something was wrong. There was no resistance. No gunfire. No explosions. No troops. There was no one there. Confusion spread rapidly. Patrols pushed inland, searching for Japanese bunkers and ambushes. They found deserted gun positions, empty foxholes, and leftover supplies. Canned food sat unopened. Uniforms hung on makeshift racks. But the soldiers, the entire Japanese garrison, had vanished. The Americans couldn't believe it. They scoured the island, suspecting an ambush, but none came. Radio operators tried to intercept signals. Nothing. Even as the fog rolled in and the tension remained high, it became clear. Kiska was empty. The Japanese had evacuated the island 2 weeks earlier, under the cover of fog, without the Allies knowing. It was one of the most daring and successful evacuations of the war. Using submarines and surface ships, the Japanese had removed more than 5,000 soldiers, slipping past Allied patrols and radar. They left behind decoys, radios, and false signs of activity to maintain the illusion of occupation. For weeks, the Allies had bombed and shelled an island that was already abandoned. But the strangeness didn't end there. Despite the absence of Japanese troops, casualties still occurred. In the confusion and poor visibility, American and Canadian soldiers stumbled into minefields. Units became disoriented. In one tragic incident, U.S. and Canadian forces mistakenly fired on each other, thinking they were under enemy attack. By the end of the Kiska operation, nearly 200 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded, not by the enemy, but by accidents, mines, and friendly fire. The battlefield had become a ghost story. A deadly one. Still, with the occupation of Kiska complete, the Aleutian campaign was over. For the first time since the war began, there were no enemy troops on American soil. The campaign had lasted more than a year. It had claimed thousands of lives. It had seen one of the most brutal land battles in the Pacific, and one of the most surreal amphibious invasions in history. But for many Americans, it was still unknown, overshadowed by the bigger battles to come. And yet, in the wind and fog of those lonely islands, history had been made. The last shots in the Aleutian campaign were fired not at the enemy, but by accident, a tragic, final echo of confusion on an island where the enemy was already gone. With the official occupation of Kiska in August 1943, the United States and Canada had finally driven Japanese forces from American soil. The Aleutian Islands were once again under Allied control. But the scars of the campaign ran deep, especially for those who had fought and bled on Attu. In total, the campaign had lasted 437 days. It had cost the lives of over 3,800 Japanese soldiers, nearly all of them perishing in the frozen mud of Attu or during the evacuation from Kiska. On the Allied side, over 1,500 Americans were killed or wounded, many in the brutal, fog-choked valleys of Attu. Hundreds more suffered lasting effects from exposure, frostbite, and disease. And then there were the Aleut people, the native inhabitants of the region. Often forgotten in official histories, the Aleuts suffered a tragedy of their own. When the Japanese invaded Attu, the entire native population, fewer than 50 people, was taken as prisoners of war and shipped to Japan. Many would not survive the ordeal. Meanwhile, on the U.S. side of the Aleutian chain, the government forcibly evacuated Aleut villages, placing thousands of native residents in internment camps in southeast Alaska. These camps were poorly supplied and lacked adequate shelter. Dozens died from illness and malnutrition. Many would never return to their homes. The land ravaged by war had been stripped from them in the name of national security. As the war moved south toward the Philippines and west toward Iwo Jima, the Aleutian Islands faded into obscurity. The battle was rarely mentioned in speeches, and the headlines focused on Europe, Normandy, and the race toward Berlin. The fog that had clouded every moment of the Aleutian conflict now seemed to settle over its memory, dimming its place in the broader narrative of World War II. But for the veterans who fought there, the Aleutians were unforgettable. They remembered the biting cold, the endless mud, the eerie quiet that would suddenly explode into chaos. They remembered comrades lost to enemy bullets, and others lost to the mountains, the wind, or their own artillery. Some called it the forgotten battle, but for those who survived, it was anything but. The military, however, learned important lessons. The Aleutian campaign exposed the need for cold weather combat training, better Arctic logistics, and improved communication systems. The unpredictable weather and remote conditions had created countless problems the military could not afford to face again unprepared. And in a strange way, the campaign had served as a warning. The Japanese occupation of Attu and Kiska proved that America's remote frontiers were not immune to attack. It was a wake-up call, one that influenced post-war thinking about Alaska's strategic importance. In the years that followed, radar stations, air bases, and Cold War-era defenses would be built across the northern edge of the continent, many of them first imagined in the fog of the Aleutians. But the battle, and the sacrifices made there, would never receive the attention of D-Day or Guadalcanal. The soldiers of Attu and Kiska returned home quietly. There were no grand parades, no triumphant newsreels, just silence, like the wind rolling across those barren volcanic ridges. The war had moved on, but they had not forgotten. In the years that followed World War II, the story of the Aleutian campaign became little more than a footnote in history books, a side chapter in a war filled with louder, bloodier headlines. The beaches of Normandy, the jungles of Guadalcanal, the streets of Berlin. These were the battles that came to define the war. But the battle in the fog, the fight for a handful of frozen islands at the edge of the world, slowly faded from memory. For the men who fought there, the silence was deafening. Veterans of Attu and Kiska returned home to find that few people even knew where they had been. Families welcomed them back, but their stories often fell flat in living rooms and dinner tables. How do you explain a battlefield where the enemy is fog and frost, and your worst wounds come from cold, confusion, and friendly fire? Unlike the dramatic invasions of Europe and the Pacific Islands, the Aleutian battles were waged in isolation, without press coverage, without crowds of cheering civilians, and with almost no footage to preserve their memory. Reporters rarely went there. Politicians didn't speak of it. And soldiers, like so many veterans, often kept the pain to themselves. Even memorials to the campaign were scarce. While monuments were erected at Pearl Harbor and Normandy, the fallen of Attu were remembered only by their comrades, and by the wind. The battlefield remained remote, its frozen ridges still scarred with rusted helmets, sunken bunkers, and abandoned artillery. But one small group never forgot: the native Aleut communities. Their suffering had been profound. The forced evacuations during the war destroyed villages, separated families, and decimated populations. In many cases, returning Aleuts found their homes burned, their churches looted, their traditions disrupted. The U.S. government, focused on national defense, had treated them not as citizens but as security risks. It would be decades before formal apologies or compensation were issued. Still, the Aleuts endured. Their oral histories preserved what the textbooks ignored. Stories of the invasion, the camps, the cold, and the long journey home became part of a cultural memory that refused to be erased. Over time, historians began to rediscover the Aleutian campaign. Declassified documents, interviews with aging veterans, and archaeological explorations on Attu and Kiska revealed the scope and cost of what had once been considered a minor front. The full brutality of the fighting, the terrain, the weather, the psychological toll, became better understood. In 2000, the National Park Service began preserving the battlefields of the Aleutians as part of the World War II Valor and the Pacific National Monument. Remnants of bunkers, foxholes, and shell casings were documented. Efforts were made to honor the dead, both American and Japanese, who still lay beneath the soil. And slowly, the fog began to lift. New generations of historians, educators, and documentarians brought attention to the campaign. Veterans' stories, long buried, began to surface. Families began to ask questions. Schoolchildren, once unaware that World War II ever reached American soil, learned that it had, and that the land it reached was cold, jagged, and unforgiving. The Battle of the Aleutian Islands wasn't forgotten because it was unimportant. It was forgotten because it was uncomfortable, hard to reach, hard to win, and harder still to understand. But as every soldier who served there would say, it mattered. The Aleutian campaign may have been forgotten by many, but for the military minds who studied it in the years after World War II, it became a case study in extremes, of weather, terrain, isolation, and human endurance. The battles for Attu and Kiska revealed just how unprepared most modern armies were for Arctic warfare. The U.S. Army, in particular, had trained its troops in deserts and jungles, but not in the icy, fog-bound ridges of the far north. The Aleutians exposed flaws in everything from uniforms to communications to logistics. Tents collapsed in gale-force winds. Boots fell apart in freezing rain. Rifles jammed in the cold. Radios failed in the fog. And men, even the toughest, broke under the mental strain of cold, hunger, and silence. Some had to be evacuated not for injuries, but for psychological collapse. The fog wasn't just a physical presence, it was a mental one too, eroding morale and swallowing time. After the war, military strategists took note. Training programs were revised. Cold weather units were formed. Arctic gear was redesigned. The lessons of Attu and Kiska helped prepare the U.S. military for future conflicts in extreme environments, including Korea and even the Cold War standoffs in Northern Europe and Alaska. The campaign also had lasting geopolitical consequences. The surprise of the Japanese landing on American soil had shaken the nation. It proved that no corner of the U.S. was too remote to defend. As a result, Alaska's importance as a military outpost skyrocketed. Airfields were expanded. Radar stations were built. By the 1950s, the Aleutians became part of the early warning network against potential Soviet attacks, a Cold War frontier forged in the crucible of World War II. But there were other lessons, too, quieter, more human ones. The Aleutian campaign showed the danger of underestimating small battles. In global conflicts, attention naturally gravitates toward the largest invasions, the bloodiest days, the turning points. But war is also shaped by the lesser-known struggles, the remote outposts, the forgotten soldiers, the silent sacrifices. The men who fought in the Aleutians didn't win a massive theater of war. They didn't liberate a city or storm a beach to headlines. But they did something else: they held the line. They pushed back against an enemy who dared to occupy their soil. And they did it in one of the harshest, most isolating environments on Earth. Their battle changed the perception of American vulnerability. It reminded the world that the fight could come anywhere, at any time, and that no territory was too small to defend. And for the Japanese, the Aleutian campaign was a rare but sobering failure. Though initially a distraction for their larger Midway operation, their occupation of Attu and Kiska ultimately drained resources and cost lives without achieving lasting strategic gain. The failure to hold the islands contributed to growing doubts within Japan's high command about the sustainability of their Pacific expansion. In that way, the Aleutians became more than a forgotten battlefield. They became a symbolic lesson in the limits of reach, the power of resilience, and the unseen corners where wars are truly decided. The fog had hidden the war from the world. But beneath it, history had been written in the cold. Today, the Aleutian Islands remain what they were during the war: wild, wind-lashed, and remote. The battlefields of Attu and Kiska are untouched in many places, frozen in time. Rusting helmets lie half-buried in moss. Collapsed bunkers lean into the earth. Aircraft wreckage is scattered across valleys. Even spent shell casings still litter the ground, washed by endless rain and surrounded by silence. Nature has reclaimed much of the land, but the echoes remain. In Attu, there is no longer a civilian population. The native Aleut inhabitants who once lived there never returned after their wartime displacement. The island is now a protected site, part of the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, visited only by researchers, historians, and the occasional veteran's descendant. But the memory is still alive. In recent decades, efforts to recognize the significance of the Aleutian campaign have grown. In 1993, on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Attu, American and Japanese officials gathered on the island to honor the fallen. Veterans stood side by side, former enemies, now elderly men, weeping not for victory or defeat, but for friends lost, and for the horrors they endured on that unforgiving land. A memorial was placed on Attu, simple, solemn, standing against the wind, to commemorate both sides. It acknowledges the Japanese soldiers who died in one of the final banzai charges of the war, and the American soldiers who gave their lives in a place few back home ever knew existed. The Aleutian campaign has also received greater attention in education and media. Documentaries, books, and oral history projects have helped bring the story into the light. Native Aleut voices, once excluded from the wartime narrative, are now being heard, their experiences finally included in the broader history of the conflict. The lessons of the campaign endure, about preparedness, sacrifice, and the cost of forgetting. The fact that foreign troops once stood on American soil, even briefly, is a powerful reminder of how thin the line between peace and war can be, and how battles can erupt not just in the hearts of empires, but on the ragged edges of the map, in places where visibility is poor, temperatures are cruel, and the world is looking the other way. The men who fought there were not seeking glory. They didn't return home to fame or fortune. Most slipped back into quiet lives: postal workers, farmers, factory hands, teachers, carrying with them memories of a place few believed was real. And yet it was. The fog, the cold, the silence, and the enemy hidden within it, were all real. And so was their victory. It was a victory not of sweeping drama, but of persistence. Of men pushing forward in the worst conditions imaginable. Of holding the line when no one was watching. Of reclaiming what was taken, not for territory or conquest, but for principle, for memory, and for home. The Battle of the Aleutian Islands may never be as famous as Normandy or Iwo Jima. But it mattered. And now, at last, it is being remembered. And that was the forgotten battle at the edge of the world, a moment in history buried in silence, but never without meaning. If this story taught you something new, Be sure to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what surprised you most. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for spending time with us tonight. Sleep well, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next one.